structure of the day, we're going to have 8 different videos streamed, and then after each video, there'll be an opportunity for Q&A. So the meeting is scheduled till 12. We don't have enough videos pre-made to get until there, so feel free to ask lots of questions during the Q&A session, and if it goes over the 5 minutes or 10 minutes allocated for the Q&As, that's no problem. So we're going to start this morning. We're going to follow the agenda that was sent out. So the first video is going to start off with the introduction from Matthew Lawless, who works with Borage Farms, and then it's going to transition to Gary Kruger's talk, which is nitrogen loss management using Centuro and Tribune for irrigated spring wheat and durum. So I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully this works perfectly.
So my name is Matthew Lawless. I'm a partner at Borage Farms, and I'm the operations manager here. Fertigation for us, it adds some flexibility in timing to put the nitrogen down when our crop will be actively using it. So we do about 1/3 of our nitrogen requirement through fertigation shortly before the plants start flowering. So when the flower buds are building in the axils, that's when the stolons are starting to hook, and you'll get new tubers forming shortly after that. So the nitrogen demand of the crop goes up. That's when we fertigate. It all depends on weather and our other field operations, like we try and hill at this time. We're trying to spray at this time. So logistically, you know, you fit it in where you can, and you want your timing to be as best as possible. So this is pretty good timing on this field here behind us. It's one of the first ones, well, the first one that we planted this season. All red varieties on this field, and we're applying 18 gallons UAN per acre, and we'll do that over 2 passes. So we'll do about 70% of that in one pass, wait 4 or 5 days, maybe sneak some field operations in there, or wait for some rain, and then do another pass with the remaining 30%. So, and there's 12.78 pounds actual per gallon, so it kind of gives you a rough idea of where we're at. So the portable tanks, 1,000 imperial gallons, we fill them to that level. And then we have fertigation pumps. There's different kinds of pumps on the market. These are injectometers. They're an older style pump, but they work really well. There's a couple pistons that fill with the fertilizer and pump it into the main line. So they'll suck it from the tank, pump it into the main line, and we can set the stroke of the piston for more or less fertilizer depending on what we want to put through. Normally we'll do between 36 and 48 hours on the pivot, and then the pump can do so many gallons per hour. So then that's how we figure out, you know, we want to do so many gallons per acre, it can cover so many in an hour, and we do the math and we figure that out. So, and then the guys set the pump and keep an eye on it and measure the fertilizer, and after 4 or 5 hours of starting, you know, is the pump set correctly, you know, and then they just maintain it for the 48-hour cycle, and at the end of the day we know how much fertilizer we put on. So it's really quite simple. It's a nice process because, like I said earlier, it adds flexibility as to when we can get our nitrogen down there, and it's effective. I want to say too that we wouldn't be able to do it without our great irrigation crew. You know, we got 3 guys, they do a great job. This is, you know, I just tell them what to do and they go do it. This is their baby, and if not for them, we wouldn't be successful. So that's important too.
Another question for you.
Sure.
For the fertigation, do you use any nitrogen safening products in your UAN?
No.
You just use straight UAN?
Yeah, straight. Yeah.
Because I'll explain why I'm asking that.
Mm-hmm.
What we're doing this year is we're demonstrating some nitrogen protecting products that are added to the UAN that have been applied to a wheat field.
Okay.
And we're trying to see whether there's a yield response by limiting or trying to minimize the losses of N due to the volatilization of ammonia from the urea, as well as from the UAN, as well as the loss of nitrate from the soil by denitrification, and then also leaching, of course, can be a big loss factor as well, but we control that too by limiting the amount of water that we put on.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And you mentioned that you put about 70% of your N on, and then you wait a few days, and then you add the rest.
Yes.
And that's a way to try and put the N on when the crop needs it, so that it's not all there at one time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. And two, like if we tried to do it all in one shot, all of a sudden, if the pump is not set right, or an end gun is not working, or you have some other problem, then you've lost that window where you can go back the second time and try and fix it.
Right.
So we try and we try and hedge our bets a little bit. So yeah, which is important. And then some of the varieties, like it might be a week or more before we go back with the second fertigation. It all just kind of depends on the staging and other operations that we're trying to do in the field, but definitely early fields like this, as soon as we can get it on. Because we want to be digging these reds by the end of August. So the maturity needs to come soon, and we found if we delay the fertigation, we're delaying the maturity. We can't get those reds to die down and have their skin when we want to dig, and then all of a sudden we have a product that we can't sell.
That's the problem.
Yeah, big problem. Yeah.
So I'll just describe a little bit the project that ICDC is doing with spring wheat and durum wheat here on another pivot. On that particular project, we're applying 35 N per acre using UAN solution, and we applied that at the 5-leaf stage of wheat, and it's going on to both spring wheat and to durum wheat. The product has been applied in 2 passes of the pivot system, so we go at 17.5 pounds of N per pass, and the benefit of using the products, which were our Centuro and Tribune, will be compared to untreated UAN. Each of these products are additives that are added to the UAN before it's applied, and we were assessing the effectiveness of that through the grain yield that we're going to measure at the end of the season, as well as soil sampling and tissue analysis of the crop to see if we can detect some differences using those tools as well. So that's the project that we're doing.
ICDC is coordinating a project with the existence of Koch fertilizer, top dressing liquid nitrogen fertilizer to both durum and spring wheat. Centuro with the active ingredient pronitridine, which slows the conversion of ammonium to nitrate, and Tribune with the combination of active ingredients pronitridine and NBPT, which prevents hydrolysis of urea to ammonia, are additives to liquid nitrogen fertilizer that prevent nitrogen losses by these loss mechanisms. One component, the NBPT, prevents gaseous loss of ammonia into the atmosphere by blocking hydrolysis of urea. It maintains the nitrogen in the ammonium state, which has a positive charge. That positive charge allows the nitrogen to be attached to the cation exchange in the soil, in other words, the clay particles and the organic matter. This attachment prevents the nitrogen from loss as ammonia gas to the atmosphere. Keeping the nitrogen in the ammonium form also protects it from loss due to the other mechanisms, denitrification and leaching. Denitrification is the microbial conversion of nitrogen to nitrous oxides or possibly binary nitrogen gas, which would be lost to the atmosphere. This pathway is very important for protecting nitrogen in irrigated soils, because of the increased chance for saturated soil conditions that comes with irrigation. Leaching, which can also play a significant role in moving nitrogen in the soluble nitrate form through the soil profile beyond the reach of plant roots, is also a mechanism that is protected from loss by these products. The specific project conducted by ICDC will top dress 35 pounds of N per acre in the form of UAN, urea ammonium nitrate solution. These 35 N will be applied to both spring wheat and durum at the 5-leaf stage. The product will then be applied. The product will be applied in 2 passes of the pivot system, each one supplying 17.5 pounds of N per acre. The benefit of using Centuro or Tribune will be compared to the untreated UAN. Each of the nitrogen loss prevention products are marketed by Koch Fertilizers. They are an additive that's added to liquid nitrogen fertilizer prior to the fertigation process. The effectiveness is going to be assessed through soil and plant tissue analysis, as well as grain yield determined with a weigh wagon. These 2 products add an approximately 10-cent increase per pound of N to the cost of the nitrogen fertilizer. Currently, UAN is trading for about $300 a ton.
Okay, so that was Gary's talk, and now Gary, if you'd like to unmute, and we'll open up the floor to Q&A. So I see there's a few new participants. I mentioned before there's 2 different ways you can ask the speakers questions. You can either ask using the mic, so I'd ask you to raise your hand before that, and then I'll prompt you to speak, or you can use the chat function, which is in the toolbar near the bottom of the screen, and you just click on show conversation, and then you can type your question. So I'll open up now for any questions. Well, I got a question, Gary. Has there been much adoption of fertigation in conventional crops in the past and around Outlook or in Saskatchewan?
Fertigation is something that I would say producers are experimenting with and trying, and as you heard from Matthew earlier, potato farmers tend to be the ones that are using it most, but the other irrigators are using it on their crops as well. Most of the irrigators have a system, and they just rotate it around to the field where they would like to apply the nitrogen fertilizer.
Great, thanks. Any other questions? Okay, if not, thank you, Gary, for being around to answer questions, and hopefully that video went through to everybody okay. With that, we'll move on to our next presentation. So our next presenter will be Erin Karppinen. She is the new co-research director with ICDC, and she'll be talking about a couple of different projects. So the first project is titled Demonstrating Spring Wheat Phosphorus Fertilizer Response on Severely Phosphorus Deficient Irrigated Fields. And the second project she'll be talking about is an evaluation of the yield response of spring wheat to varying rates, time, and placement of phosphorus fertilizer on a deficient phosphorus soil under irrigated production. So I will play the video, and then afterwards she'll be around to answer any questions.
Hi, my name is Dr. Erin Karppinen, and I just started with ICDC in April as a co-research director. I am originally from Chicory, so Outlook is home to me. I spent some time prior to this working as an environmental consultant in the private industry, and most recently was working at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Swift Current. So I'm standing in front of a project that evaluates the yield response of spring wheat to various rates, timing, and placement of phosphorus fertilizer on an irrigated field that has extremely low levels of available phosphorus. The funding for this project was provided by ADOPT, which comes from both the provincial and federal governments, as well as Fertilizer Canada. So ICDC acquired this land, which is adjacent to the Canada-Saskatchewan Irrigation Diversification Centre, and it was farmed by local producers for many years. We collected a soil sample in the fall, and the test came back with very low levels of phosphorus. It was about 2 ppm or 4 pounds per acre. The soil test also recommended that we apply an additional 43 pounds per acre of phosphorus. So phosphorus is really important for early season crop growth, and ultimately it will influence the final yield. So this early season growth is known as the pop-up effect, and it's commonly seen when you're applying phosphorus as seed placed. And in general, Saskatchewan has very low phosphorus levels when compared to other geographies in North America. This is a result of some uncontrollable factors like the parent material, but it's also a result of some agricultural practices such as under-fertilization. We export more phosphorus in our grains than we apply as fertilizer, so over time this creates an overall phosphorus deficit in the soil. So when we do apply phosphorus, the fertilizer use efficiency is very low. So the plant is only able to use about 20% of the phosphorus that we put down. So it's very crucial that we optimize our fertilization using the 4R principles, and that means we're going to apply fertilizer using the right rate, the right source, the right time, and the right place. So for this project, we used monoammonium phosphate, which is 11-52-0, and that was applied in both the spring and the fall to determine the right time, and it was side banded and seed placed to determine the right place, and it was also applied at 20, 40, and 60 pounds per acre to determine the right rate. We also included a control that did not receive any phosphorus fertilizer, and the fall treatments were applied late October 2019, and the spring wheat was seeded on May 14th, and we also side banded 100 pounds per acre of nitrogen during seeding. So phosphorus does not move well in the soil, so the seed-placed applications that are close to the root are the most desirable. However, this is not always practical if the recommended application rate exceeds the safe amount of seed-placed fertilizer. So in this case for cereals, that safe seed-placed application rate is about 25 to 30 pounds per acre, and we have a treatment in this project that goes up to 60 pounds per acre. So in this case, side banding might be more appropriate than a seed-placed fertilizer, just because of we might see seed damage due to fertilizer toxicity at those really high rates. So a fall side band application rather than phosphorus that's side banded or seed placed in the spring might also save some time during seeding if that can be done ahead of time. Although we won't have any of the yield results until we harvest in the fall, we have been able to visually see difference in growth between our treatments. So our control was fertilized with nitrogen, but it did not receive any phosphorus, so growth was limited, but we did see a strong pop-up effect in all treatments that received any amount of phosphorus fertilizer. So here we have the 0 phosphorus control, and then next to it is phosphorus applied at 20 pounds per acre here, and then 40 pounds per acre, and finally 60 pounds per acre. And these were all banded in the fall, so we can see increases in growth with that increasing rate of phosphorus fertilization. A similar effect is seen in the spring banded treatments. So again, we have the 0 phosphorus control, and then 20, 40, and 60 pounds per acre of phosphorus. There is an increase in growth with the increasing fertilizer rate, but it is not as pronounced as what we were seeing with the fall banded applications. You would expect a soil this deficient to respond positively to phosphorus fertilizer, but it will be interesting to find out if the yield different response from the fall versus the spring sideband applications is comparable. So finally, we have the seed place phosphorus fertilizer. Right here is the 20 pounds per acre and then 40 pounds per acre, which appeared to have a bit of hair pinning at the beginning of the plot, and then 60 pounds per acre here. So it doesn't appear that we had any damage to this plot with 60 pounds per acre of phosphorus, and actually all of the 3 fertilizer rates show excellent growth. So next year, these plots are going to be reseeded to canola without any additional phosphorus fertilizer inputs, and that's just going to allow us to evaluate the effects on the following year's crop and determine if we can see any carryover effect of the different phosphorus fertilizer treatments. So thanks for tuning in, and make sure to check back this winter when we post an update with more results from this project.
Okay, great. Now I guess I'll open it up for Erin to answer questions. So Erin, if you want to turn on your mic and webcam, and anybody can ask your question either through their mic or through the chat function.
Okay, I think I have my microphone on.
Yep, looks good.
Okay, perfect.
So do we have any questions for Erin from anybody? Looks like we have a shy audience today. Okay, we got one here from Gary Kruger, so I'll just read it out to you.
Sure.
How many days of difference in development of the spring wheat do we see at this time?
So I'm not quite sure. I don't have my notes with me, so because we did take heading notes. I don't know if Gary remembers if we had any differences there, but I actually can't. I can't remember if we saw anything.
Okay, now feel free to jump in too if you have any comments on that.
It looked to me by the slides that you showed that there was some difference there, and I was just asking you to quantify that a bit for us.
Yeah, I don't, I take it my mic may be on.
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah.
We were seeing some differences, Gary, in both time to heading and into emergence. Or, sorry, not in emergence, to heading. But we haven't analyzed it fully yet at this stage. But you know, one of the attributes of phosphorus is to enhance maturity, and we were seeing that as we moved up the phosphorus application rates. There were differences in the heading notes that we obtained, and generally, you know, an advancement of heading. So the plants tended to head out a little ahead of as we progressed up the application rate, but they were modest. You know, they were a day or two. So we will capture at maturity, we will continue and capture maturity notes and see if that is enhanced further or accelerated further by the end of the season.
Great. Thanks for that response. Is there any other questions from the audience? If not, well, thank you very much, Erin, for being on to answer some questions today, and I guess we'll proceed to the next video. So the next talk is done by myself. So I'm Joel Peru. I'm an irrigation agrologist with the ministry, and I'm going to be talking about some of the crop production surveys that we're doing this summer. So just get it loaded here and we'll be good to go.
Hello, my name is Joel Peru and I'm an irrigation agrologist with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture. Today I'm going to be talking about the irrigated crop production surveys that myself and my colleague Gary Kruger are implementing this summer. During the 2020 growing season, we're looking at 3 different crops grown under irrigation in the Lake Deep-Maker development area. They include canola, flax, and faba bean. First, I'll briefly touch on the canola survey, which is actually a continuation of the canola survey that we started in 2019. So this survey is looking at 15 different irrigated fields by 15 individual irrigators, and we're trying to track production methods to determine which are the most effective at providing the best economic return for growing canola under irrigation. We're tracking everything that the producer does and everything that might have an effect on the final yield of the crop. So that includes things such as soil texture, fertility, seeding date, harvest date, herbicides, pesticides being used, varieties, and pretty much anything that will impact the economics and the yield of the crop. We also track the irrigation events and the rainfall events to see how much total moisture each crop is using. So if we see that we're getting good yields off of more moisture or less moisture, that's something we're going to be reporting on. We also help each individual schedule the irrigation by running their fields through a model called AIM, which is the Alberta Irrigation Management Model, and providing them weekly irrigation scheduling charts to help provide them prediction of when they need to irrigate next. So we do this by setting up rain gauges, one in a dryland corner and one underneath the pivot, to track the total amount of moisture, and then we check them on a weekly basis and run them through the model, which takes into account things like solar radiation, wind speed, crop water use, and pretty much anything that would have to do with evapotranspiration. And then it makes a prediction based off of historical weather data on when you should irrigate next. It's not a perfect tool, but it is a good guide that producers can use to assist them with making their irrigation scheduling decisions. We are also experimenting with new software developed by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada called Irrigation. So this is a software using ArcGIS satellite imagery. It takes NDVI photos on a weekly basis of everywhere in Western Canada, and it can be used actually to help predict crop moisture use and irrigation scheduling as well. We also include these individual fields into ministry-wide initiatives such as the Canola Disease Survey. So the Canola Disease Survey is a thorough survey that evaluates all major diseases that are in the fields, and we're doing this for every one of the 15 fields, and then we're submitting this to the ministry so they can use this information to help create their disease pressure maps, which are available on the ministry's website. Canola continues to be a major irrigated crop in the province, making up around 30% of the irrigated crop mix on an annual basis. And we expect irrigated acres to grow substantially in the next 10 years, and we expect canola to continue being a very important crop for this sector. Canola is considered to be a high returning crop compared to other major crops such as wheat and barley. And from the economic guide that we updated in 2019, we saw that a 70 bushel an acre crop can provide a net return of $150 an acre. So we hope after doing this survey for 3 years, we're able to get some good takeaways from irrigators that have been doing this for a long time, and promote promote the best production method practices, so we can help increase those yields and economics to even higher levels. To learn more about what we saw in the 2019 growing season, there's a write-up done in the November issue of the Irrigator of 2019, and we also discussed it at various extension events such as the 2019 SEPA Irrigation Conference in Moose Jaw. There will be a formal report written after the 3 years have concluded, so there'll be more updates on that once it's ready. One more takeaway that we also get from doing these type of surveys is updating our publications with more realistic numbers. So actually seeing what producers are getting in their irrigated production on an annual basis helps us make our guides more realistic and hopefully more usable for producers. We usually set target yields and average yields in our publications, such as the ICDC Economics and Agronomics Guide, and we use these surveys to help make those numbers more realistic. So as you can see, we get lots of useful information out of this survey, not only for our own use, but hopefully for irrigators' use as well. So now I'm going to talk about a couple of other crops we're looking at this year, which are new to us. So my colleague Gary Kruger is leading this initiative on these two crops, flax and Faba beans. So first of all, I'll talk about what we're doing with flax. So all these surveys are structurally the same, although with flax it's a little different because it's a lower acre crop grown on irrigation. It typically only makes up around 4 or 5% of the irrigated crop mix, and it has a lot of different economic practices when compared to other more conventionally grown crops. It is a longer season crop, and irrigation, added irrigation makes it even longer, and then if you're adding things like fungicides, it can really prolong the growing season of this crop. Also, we've seen in the past that flax is very susceptible to weed pressure, and it can be a major issue for growers. It was one of the top performing crops economically in our 2020 version of the Economics and Economics Guide, and it showed that 50 bushel an acre flax crop can provide a net return of over 200 bushels an acre. So we hope that we can track, we're looking at 4 different irrigators here and their flax production practices, and we're hoping to track these and find the best practices that are working for irrigators, and then extend this so we can promote flax as a crop that can be an economic performer under irrigation in Saskatchewan. The final crop we're looking at is Faba beans. So Faba bean is more of a niche crop under irrigation, although it has been growing here for a long time. It has very low acres, but from producer feedback last year, for a couple of producers that did grow it, they boasted very promising economic returns for this crop. So Faba bean definitely has some advantages for being grown under irrigation when comparing it to other pulse crops. It's a high water user, has very high yield potential. In Alberta, I know they've gotten yields well over 100 bushels an acre in this crop. And it's more resistant to root rots when comparing it to field pea or lentils. So if the prices are strong for this crop and you're getting these high yields, then it can be a very promising economic crop grown on irrigation. So producers are seeing continued success with this crop. We can capture that and then extend it out to other irrigators. If this crop continues to be successful to be grown on irrigation, both agronomically and economically, it will be an important pulse crop to include in your crop mix as an irrigator in Saskatchewan. Both the flax survey and the Faba bean survey are only intended to last 1 year, which is subject to change, but there will be reports presented on both of these surveys at the end of the year. Just to give a general overview of what we've seen this year so far in terms of irrigated crop production in the Lake Diefenbaker development area. We've seen a really good year so far in terms of growing season. We've had very timely rains. We're comparing that to 2019. We got most of our rain in big shots in July, which created some issues for irrigators in terms of their scheduling. Irrigators were struggling to keep up with the irrigation scheduling because of the dry, warm climates. Then we got hit by those big showers, and this created issues with oversaturation of the soil. This year we're not seeing that, and we're seeing some very beautiful crops around Lake Diefenbaker, and we're really looking forward to see what kind of yields are being pulled off this harvest. So stay tuned for more information about this survey and other extension events that we're going to be putting on, and we look forward to talking about some of the major takeaways that we get from these different surveys.
Okay, well that concludes my brief overview of the crop production surveys that we're working on this summer. I guess I'll open up to any questions now, if there's any questions from the audience. Well, we're planning to do more videos on the surveys too, especially once we complete certain milestones such as the disease surveys, just to kind of give an update of what's happening around Lake Diefenbaker. So stay tuned for more information about that, and we'll be definitely giving some updates on irrigation scheduling recommendations as well, and any other pest issues that we see in these different crops that we're monitoring. Okay, I got a couple questions here. So Travis asks, have you noticed any trends from previous years in your canola survey that has provided higher yields? I'd say yes. I've kind of mentioned in the video that last year we saw irrigators that were able to not oversaturate their soil moisture and weren't quite as aggressive as irrigating at the start. They did see a little bit of a yield bump. So I think this is just because of those large rains that we got in July that kind of caught people off guard, and people were trying to keep their moisture over 80-90% available moisture. And we got those big rains, and it caused just too much moisture to happen at once. Other than that, earlier seeding dates seem to usually have a bit of a yield bump, and there's only been 1 year of the canola survey, so not too many trends yet, but I think once we get this year done, we'll definitely see some more information. Anthony asks, are you hoping to make a best management practice worksheet for the crops from the survey? So yeah, that's definitely one of the intentions of this, is to see what producers are getting the best economic returns, and then capturing what they're doing and extend that out. This isn't scientific or anything, this is just observation based. But if we see certain practices consistently performing better than others over a 3-year survey, then we can use this as a general recommendation anyway. And we hope to have this in formats such as a fact sheet as well as the final report. So it'll be maybe a 1-pager bulletin that ICDC can use to extend this. Any other questions? If not, I have been getting reports that the video stream, when I share my screen, is a little bit choppy. I think that's because our office internet bandwidth might be overloaded right now with people streaming the video. So if everybody can just stand by for 1 minute, I'm going to try to switch my internet over to a hotspot on my mobile device here and see if that helps with that choppiness. So I will be back in hopefully under a minute. Okay, I'm connected to my phone now, so we'll see if that helps with the streaming. If not, I apologize for the choppiness. It's one thing I didn't anticipate is when there's a lot of people using the same internet connection, it can slow down streaming. But anyway, the audio seems to be working good, so hopefully you can still understand the majority of the content that's being streamed. So our next speaker is Travis Pierdon, and he'll be talking about couple projects as well. And the video, I think, gives a brief introduction to those projects. So I'll just go ahead and open that video.
My name is Travis Pearden. I'm a livestock and feed extension specialist with Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture out of the Outlook Regional Office. Today we're in a cornfield and I'm going to talk to you about a project that we have going on. So our project is corn silage yield under high fertility conditions. So we all know that corn is a relatively new crop to the province of Saskatchewan, and as a group we kind of questioned whether or not we were pushing the fertility hard enough on corn in order to maximize yield. So for this project we're on an irrigated site north of Outlook. And typically the producers that we work with, he targets a yield of 20 short ton an acre. So what we wanted to do was, we have 8 acres of this field is fertilized for 20 ton. And then we also looked at the soil test results, and we've got another 8 acres that we're targeting 24 ton per acre. And then another 8 acres where we're targeting 28 ton per acre. So for this trial, so last fall we did a soil analysis on the field to see what our base nutrient levels were. We broadcast most of the fertilizer on with a floater this spring, and then the producer is going to go back in with his irrigation system and fertigate on some more nitrogen. So we broadcast on before seeding a blend of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur, and then he's going to put on about 90 pounds per acre of nitrogen through his irrigation system. So we're going to follow this crop through the summer. We're going to take some tissue samples for analysis. We're also going to do some satellite monitoring of the field to see if we can notice a difference in the treatments. And then, of course, in the fall, during harvest, we're going to take yield measurements from the field. After harvest, we're going to look at, we'll take forage samples, send them off to see what our nutrient levels are. We're also going to make sure to check for nitrates to see if we have any effect on nitrates, having that high of nitrogen level in this crop. And we're also going to soil test after harvest to see just the level of nutrients left over to see if we used what we put on and how that will turn out for us. We are at the research farm at Outlook. We're at an irrigated site. And what we're looking at here today is a double cropping system that we're working on this summer. So what we did last fall, we seeded fall rye. We have both conventional varieties and hybrid varieties. And they're just at the late flowering stage right now. So we're going to silage those here probably in about another week. And then our intention is to go back in and seed oats, barley, and millet back into those plots where we have the rye. So this is a double cropping system. We're going to take off 2 silage crops within 1 year. We all know that land costs are going up, so we need to maximize the production that we have off of every acre. So this type of system, hopefully will allow us to generate a lot more forage production than our typical 1 crop per year type of system. We also did seed spring barley and spring oats and millet early in May, so we're going to look at those and see how those systems compare for economics as well as feed quality and tonnage in comparison to our double crop system. So behind me are the spring seeded crops that were part of this trial. So our millet was fairly unsuccessful at establishing. We seeded this early May. I think the soil temperatures were just too cold for a warm season crop like millet. So that's something to keep in mind when using a crop like millet. Our barley and oats look really good. Both established well. They had good fertility. They were irrigated off the start, and we've had good rainfall here at Outlook. So all these crops are looking good. We're hoping that when we go back in and seed millet after we take off the fall rye, that our soil temperature is obviously going to be a lot warmer, so hopefully we can have more success with that crop as part of this trial.
Travis, have you seen much adoption of double cropping under irrigation in Saskatchewan yet?
I think it's kind of a new concept. It's it's been used in Alberta more, I would say. So I think it's something new that we just wanted to demonstrate and see how successful we could be with it. We had a bit of a cold spring, so like ideally we would have had our rye silage off before the end of June. So this year we did it on July 3rd, and then we were able to reseed those plots on July 6th. So we're maybe a week behind where I would have liked to have been with it. So we'll just depend on how the rest of our summer goes and see how successful our follow-up crops are.
Because I have one more question regarding the corn project. So I know ICDC has been doing work on both green corn and silage corn now for multiple years. Do you think this has had an impact on the irrigated acres of silage corn, or do you think it's still being kind of just slowly adopted?
Yeah, I think it's the work that has been done in the past has been quite important, like especially with the different variety trials that were done just to find or see which varieties actually work best in Saskatchewan here. So we've always, with the variety trials, we could definitely see that the higher corn heat unit varieties maybe weren't such a good fit the last few years. So it seems like the kind of the lower corn heat units matured enough to produce the best yields for us. So that's something that has come out of the research done in the past.
Great, thanks. I see Gary now, which has his hand raised. So Gary, if you want to ask your question now, go ahead.
Travis, this field you indicated was north of Outlook. This is a producer that has had a prior history of corn on that field?
Yeah, so this particular field, this is the second year that corn has been grown on it. So okay. That's one thing we did notice was that the producer had a very good yield last year. He had over 20 ton an acre, and that crop used a lot of nutrients. So we did notice that our soil test results were probably below average, I would say, for most nutrients.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking is I think we could, there's really two things that we need to discern when it comes to developing some nitrogen recommendations for corn. One of them would be on fields that had a prior history of corn, and one would be on virgin fields. Because in that first year of corn production, the rooting system of the corn can go down 6 to 8 feet. So it's going to be drawing, and this comes from experience. We had a PAMI study a number of years ago, and we failed to really show yield responses to nitrogen, but they were all on virgin fields. And I think what was happening was they were utilizing a lot of the nitrogen that may be in a profile from 3 to 8 feet that our previous crops were unable to tap into. But I suspect that, if you were to replant corn on that field in subsequent years, you would see a far more dramatic yield response to nitrogen fertilizer applications.
Yeah, and I think so that kind of is going to work well for this because with corn being on there last year and our nitrogen fertility from the soil test was quite low. So it I think what you talked about is going to be quite relevant for this this trial, Gary.
Yeah, good, thanks.
Okay, we have a question here in the chats from Don. So Don wants to know which barley and oat varieties we're using for these trials.
So for those trials, we have Maverick barley, which is a forage variety, and also Haymaker oats, with Haymaker is also a forage variety of oats.
Okay, great. Any other questions from the audience? If not, thank you very much, Travis, for your time, and we'll proceed to the next speaker.
All right, thanks, Joel.
So our next speaker will be Gary Nadowich, and he is going to be talking about some work at ICDC looking at field pea fertility. So I'll open up here and he'll introduce himself in the video.
Hi, my name is Gary Nadowich, and I'm co-research director for ICDC here at the CSIDC Research Station in Outlook, Saskatchewan. What we've got behind us is obviously some field peas, and we're looking in particular here at field pea fertility. This is a trial that is funded through the Sask Pulse Growers. And it is being headed up, the principal investigator is Chris Holzapfel at Indian Head, or the IHARF Agri-Arm site at Indian Head, Saskatchewan. What you're seeing behind us is one of 6 trials that we've got spread throughout the province at Agri-Arm facilities. Specifically, those trials, or those facilities at Swift Current, Scott, Melfort, Yorkton, Indian Head, and obviously here in Outlook. This is the 2nd year of trials, so I'll give you a little bit of a brief background and an overview of some of the findings that we found last year. Again, all 6 trials are underway again this year. I don't know if it will go to 3 years. We will see, I guess, depending on what we find this year. So what we're looking at is pea fertility. Why pea fertility? Let's back up a little bit and talk about peas in general. You know, they're a pulse crop. The reason we chose peas for this study is its multi-location type of functionality of peas at the 6 sites that we've got. Peas are the most widely grown pulse crop in the province, and they're the most adapted to the climatic zones or the soil zones that we've got. So they can be grown in the south all the way to the north and from east to west. So it works out, you know, unlike some of the other pulses, for example, chickpea and lentil, primarily the drier areas of the province, the southwest. Faba beans are, you know, a crop that can handle moisture, and they're a cool season pulse, so the northeast are the best bets, or the eastern side of the province. Soybeans, again, the southwest, or southeast, I should say. So peas work well for us, looking at these fertility type of trials when we're looking at multi-locations across the province. In terms of the fertility that we're looking at, 3 basically nutrients that we're concentrating on: nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Nitrogen, it's a pulse crop. Generally, we rely on nitrogen fixation, so we encourage, you know, producers to make sure that they're doing a job, or a well job, of inoculating their peas prior to seeding. And generally, the research suggests across Western Canada that if you do a proper inoculation with a reputable inoculant being used, there is not a great requirement for potential nitrogen fertilizer additions. Phosphorus and sulfur. Phosphorus is the one we're going to key on. I'm going to jump across and go to sulfur. Generally, again, in Western Canada, sulfur responses of field peas to sulfur fertilization are rare, very rare. I think there was a study by Ross McKenzie out in Alberta, and he found something like 2 out of 32 trials had some sort of hint of a sulfur response. And it's very hard to correlate your responses to soil test sulfur, because soil test sulfur is so variable within any given field. It is highly variable. So it's hard trying to get a response basis of a soil test recommendation for sulfur. In this study, what we're looking at is all of the treatments, including the check, have a bit of nitrogen fertilizer. And it's simply because our sulfur source is ammonium sulfate, our phosphorus source is a monoammonium phosphorus, or monoammonium, yes, phosphorus. So we're looking at 11% nitrogen in that phosphorus fertilizer. We're looking at 21% of nitrogen in the sulfur carrier. Obviously, to balance, you know, our treatment so that we get a balanced effect across here, we had to apply nitrogen across the board. The rate that we've applied is roughly 17 pounds of nitrogen. So we can view it as a bit of a starter effect. We've also, with the nitrogen, we've taken that base of 17 or a starter effect, and we've also jumped it up, and we've looked at a 40-pound application rate, really two ways. We're looking at 40 pounds of ESN. ESN is a slow release nitrogen, so we're trying to see if there is a trickle effect of nitrogen feeding throughout the summer that would not knock off or inhibit nitrogen fixation to occur, and be able to give us a little bit of a nitrogen response. We've also come in at about the 6-7 node stage of peas, and we've broadcast 40 pounds or up to 40 pounds of nitrogen as urea to see whether top dressed application will do. And really what we're measuring here are two things. Yield is obviously one of them, but the second one that we're looking at is protein content. Yield is a giving. That is your bread and butter, is your yield response that you are getting to your any inputs that you're applying to your pea crop. But there's a general interest right now in protein, not only in pulses, but across the board. But if we look at the pulses, there's been a number of pulse fractionation plants built across Western Canada. There are more that are under consideration to be built. And with the advent of things like Beyond Meat, protein content and plant-based protein content is becoming a concern and potentially a market-driven commodity. So there could be value in producing high-protein pulse crops. So we are looking both those aspects within this study. High or yield potential and protein response. With the sulfur or with the phosphorus, we'll jump back to it. We are looking at rates of 0, 20, 40, 60, and 80 pounds. Those are sideband applications. Anything beyond 15 pounds in a seed place position with pulses can cause damage. Certainly anything above 20 is generally considered a bit of a risk factor. So we have sidebanded all those applications. When it comes to sulfur, we're looking at 5, 10, and 15 pounds of actual sulfur going applied or on. I will tell you right now, this was seeded on the 15th of May, probably a week later than we would have liked to have seen. We are just starting to see some flower initiation. I'm not going to walk you through the plots because we're not seeing a great deal of response yet. We'll back up and talk about last year, some of the stuff that we've seen at Outlook and in general what was found across the 6 sites. Last year, we did not see a response to any additional nitrogen fertilizer. So our inoculation was generally probably carrying us through to what we needed for optimal yield. That's it, with that little bit of 17 pounds that had been applied. We can't pull out the differences really with those. I shouldn't say that. We do have an absolute check in here where there's no fertilizer applied whatsoever. And across the board last year at all 6 sites, it was certainly the lowest yielding. There was an advantage to fertilizer additions. Possibly a little bit to that 17 pounds of nitrogen, but we think in general across the board, and certainly at Outlook, the biggest response we got was to phosphorus fertilizer. At Outlook, our highest yield occurred with the 40 pounds of P2O5. We were sitting on a soil test last year of approximately 11 ppm of phosphorus. So, the borderline as to whether we should have been, certainly at that level, we should have been seeing some sort of response. And in general, that was the case across all 6 sites. 40 pounds of P2O5 seemed to give us our optimum application. Economically is another thing, though. Kind of borderline at a number of the sites, hence that's why we're doing it again and repeating it. Certainly at Outlook, our economic response probably came at about 20 pounds of P2O5. The advantage to going up to 40 may have not been there economically. It was kind of a break even. We weren't, if we lost $1 or $2, there may still have been some merit to doing that if your intent as a producer is to try to build your phosphorus soil test levels up. You know, by going to the 40 pounds, much of that would be available for the following cereal crop that you would rotate into, or, you know, oilseed crop, depending on what you were looking at. So some of it would have been available, but with time, you know, it would have helped build up. I'll tell you right now, with the sulfur, we saw absolutely no response really across any of the 6 sites. At Yorkton, there may have been just a slight indication of a sulfur response. At Outlook, absolutely not. And that's not unusual. We don't apply any sulfur fertilizer. I don't apply any sulfur fertilizer with our canola, and we can go 100 bushels plus of canola here. The reason we don't apply sulfur is with every inch of irrigation water we are applying, we are receiving 3 to 5 pounds of sulfur. So historically, on a research station like this that has got 50 years of irrigation research that has been conducted, or irrigation frequency, we've applied a lot of sulfur over the years. Typically, our soil tests are coming back at 120 pounds plus sulfur, you know, in the 0 to 6 inches. So sulfur responses weren't predicted, you know, weren't expected, and certainly weren't realized. As I said, nitrogen, we didn't really see a response in yield, and interesting enough, we did not see a protein response. With the phosphorus, again, we did not see, in general, a protein response at Outlook. Again, with the 40 pounds of P2O5, we were seeing just a slight bounce in protein. It wasn't significant, but it was worthy of repeating the trial to see if we can get a better idea as to whether phosphorus was helping. And the role of phosphorus is not to create protein, or not to develop protein per se. The role of phosphorus in the plant is to allow nitrogen. It drives the nitrogen cycle and allows nitrogen to do its bit for both yield and protein. So that's where we are. As I say, all 6 sites have it out again this year. We will obviously revisit this in the winter time and give you your responses. I will talk a little bit, or back up and say a little bit about last year, in particular at Outlook. My regret is that we did not do biomass sampling last year, because for both the nitrogen and for the phosphorus applications, we saw visual responses that in terms of vegetative growth. So the amount of plant material that we are producing in the plots, as you step from 20 to 40 to 60 to 80 pounds of P2O5, we saw more height and more biomass production. It was the same way as we went from 0 to the 17 to the 40 pounds of nitrogen. Stepwise incremental increase in biomass production. But at the end of the day, the season is not long enough to allow the plants to translate that biomass into seed yield production. And it's the general reason that, you know, starter nitrogen fertilizers is generally not recommended for most of the pulses, because, and more often than not, we don't see that benefit in terms of a yield response. But we certainly were seeing it in biomass. Whether that biomass is a good thing or bad, it's an indication of a healthier plant, that's for sure. But with the increase of biomass, the downside there too, particularly under irrigation, is a thicker, fuller canopy that tends to hold the humidity longer after each irrigation event. And disease can be a factor for us. We didn't see it last year, haven't seen it this year. Last year, if you keep in mind, it was a decent amount of in-season rainfall later in the season. Our irrigation intensity was relatively high, but the days were constantly windy. So we had air movement through the canopy, and hence we didn't see any real disease pressure last year. Anyway, come back to us this winter and we'll recap the results from this year.
Maybe what I will point out too, I talked about the massive amount of vegetative, the strong visual responses that we saw in plant growth last year. I don't recall the actual number of the soil test recommendation, but I was on a field here at CSIDC that had a relatively low soil test P level. I think it was about 8 ppm, which would translate to about 16 pounds per acre of phosphorus. With that, you'd certainly have a soil test recommendation coming back, for 20 to 30 pounds of P2O5 easily. This year, we are not seeing those stepwise increments, and it's not surprising. We've rotated onto a second, obviously a different field. Soil test levels on this field in particular happen to be a little bit higher. In fact, I think we're up around 20 ppm. Which would indicate, for that level, it's higher. And our soil test recommendation, you would get a soil test recommendation from a lab coming back for 10 to 15 pounds P2O5. But really, whenever you see that type of recommendation, 10, 15 pounds, that's really what they're indicating is they want you to apply some starter phosphorus to help balance what you're going to export off. There's no real expectation of a yield gain if you're simply asking for 10 to 15 pounds of P2O5. Again, the application would be more for a replacement value to make sure that you are adding back into the soil at least a portion of what you're going to export off of that grain.
Okay, any questions from the audience? Remember, you can always use that chat function, or if you'd like to ask with your mic, just raise your hand and we'll get you on. Have you received many inquiries from producers regarding phosphorus in general around outlook here?
Well, in general, yeah. If we're going to get any questions on or questions that I do receive on nutrients, tend to be, the vast majority are nitrogen and or phosphorus, and certainly nitrogen would outweigh the phosphorus to some extent. But we're not any different than any other geography, I think, across the prairies where, nitrogen is the main nutrient that we're concerned about, followed by phosphorus, and then to a lesser extent, the other two macros, potassium and sulfur. And then, we do have, as Gary Kruger can attest to, we do get inquiries around micronutrients. And, we expect that if micronutrients are going to show up, some of them will potentially show up under irrigation because we tend to be lighter textured soils that do not have an inherent background or high level of possible nutrients on some of those soils. There's certain micronutrients at least. But yeah, we always do receive some questions on phosphorus, and I think there is a general understanding in the farm community now that we have been mining soils for a significant portion of time, and that's reflecting in our soil test reports that are coming back. And I think there is an interest in starting to at least maintain, adding a checkbook approach, or a balanced checkbook approach, so that we're trying to at least put down what we are exporting off. And we've had a number of calls over the last number of years about possible building of phosphorus, going in on those crops that are less sensitive to seed-placed phosphorus, such as cereals, and going at a higher than potentially even recommended rate from a soil test. So soil test coming back calling for 15 or 20, people are going in and applying 30 pounds P2O5. in anticipation that some of that phosphorus will help build the soil for following crops that may have some sensitivity to seed placement.
Great, thanks for your response. I see we have a couple more questions here in the chat now. Before we go ahead, though, I'll just remind everybody that's not presenting to disable their webcam, so you can do that in that little toolbar at the bottom of the screen, just so the focus can be on the presenter. So from Sherry Lynn, she wants to know if there's any thoughts on recropping the trials to wheat or canola to see if the nutrient effects carry through are emphasized, especially if there was more biomass or not.
Yeah, ideally, Sherry Lynn, if we had some resources to do that sort of thing, I'd be certainly in favor. And you know, so bottom line with these studies, no, we are not. Those fields are generally part of the system that we've established at CSIDC with our federal partners, and they will go into filler blocks for a number of years before we rotate back on. We don't have a lot of studies on the station where we've got plots on top of plots, just because of our limitations in land base. And that would be taking that piece of ground out for a couple of years. However, with the project that Erin spoke of this year, that is on ground that ICDC does have control of, and that is going to be recropped. And again, it's a similar thing. As Erin indicated, very low, you know, in 40 years of research. I have never seen a soil test that comes back at 2 ppm phosphorus. You know, it's deficient to the point of being ridiculous. That one, we had applied for a single year of funding, and to the ministry's credit, when they approved of the funding, and with agriculture or Fertilizer Canada, they came back and asked, could we recrop that one, you know, for a second year into canola, and we will follow that up. I'd love to do it, Sherry Lynn, but we just don't have that capability right now.
Great. Okay. Another question from Scott Phillips. He wants to know what your thoughts are on mid-row banding of MAP and pulses in the current pulse year for building the FOSS in the program. Is there any chance the crop could make any gains that the year of application? And then he also mentions that it would be under 20-inch spacing.
So 20-inch spacing, I think I'm going to have to ask for a little bit of clarity here. Are the rows, are you saying that the actual crop row is at 20-inch row spacings?
No, that's 10-inch crop rows, so the mid rows.
Okay, and then the band is, yeah, so the phosphorus every 20.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, Scott, you know, 5 inches away. So if you're doing a mid row there at 10-inch row spacings, your phosphorus is being positioned 5 inches away. Let's go back to the basics. We've always considered that seed place phosphorus is the most efficient form of phosphorus, simply due to the fact that phosphorus fertilizer, once it's put into the soil from the get-go, starts to become less and less available with time. So the benefit of a seed placed application is having it there in its most available form early in the season. And again, since phosphorus is used as an energy for the plant, or it provides energy to the plant, you know, under those cold soil conditions that we experience in the earliest, or in early spring in Saskatchewan, you know, the position is favorable. That being said, I mean, historically over the years, I've looked at seed placed in sideband, either, you know, directly an inch over or an inch to the side, or as a mid-row band. Haven't seen a lot of differences. So I'm not, you know, I don't get too concerned with phosphorus. I think at a 5 inches, you probably are going to be fine. Mid-row banding, once we get up to 12-inch row spacings or 12-inch centers, you know, as we tend to see as you go further north, I guess. There we're positioning the fertilizer 6 inches away. And that to me is starting to get a little bit of a concern. I'm just not too sure whether that might be a little too far away, but I don't have experience in it. 5 inches, I really don't think you're going to be too problematic. That being said, you know, if I was on a soil that was calling for, you know, was reasonably low, I might be looking at trying to build it with that mid-row band, but you know, I know it's hard to do, but I'd almost be tempted to have a little bit going with the seed place too.
Great. Any last questions before we move on? I'm not seeing anything, so thank you very much, Gary, for being around and answering some questions. And I'm sure you guys all know how to reach out to Gary if you have any more inquiries. So our next video, the speaker is Cara Dury, who's also an irrigation agrologist with the Ministry of Agriculture, and she's going to be discussing some different potentially irrigated crops with opportunities. So I'll load up the video here and we'll play it.
Good afternoon, I'm Cara Dury from the Ministry of Agriculture, and today I'm here to talk about an adopt trial that was put forward by the Saskatchewan Herb, Spice and Specialty Agricultural Association. This is a show and grow type demonstration that was to let growers and potential buyers see some potential crops that could be grown under irrigation in Saskatchewan. Some of these crops are going to be a little more familiar to you than others, and some of them are definitely going to seem more like your garden variety type plants, but there is potential in the province to be growing these at a larger scale. The plants that we have behind me will include things like monkshood, which is over here. Now this is a plant that is actually really common to an Old English garden. It can be grown for its pharmaceutical properties, but it's also very poisonous. So when growing, it should be grown with care. An interesting one, it has potential. Moving on, we have some foxglove that also is grown for its pharmaceutical qualities. Also highly poisonous, so something else to be grown with care. So crops like this are rather going to take up a small scale. You're not going to be planting a whole quarter section to these, but it does give you an opportunity to diversify your cropping mix. Probably try a new crop with a low acre investment and try to expand into some new markets that maybe you haven't tried before. If we go a bit further down, we'll see borage, which is a more common crop that you would think of with farming a herb, spice, or specialty crop. So these plants, they can be used for their seed or even into just a fresh food category. The leaves and the flowers are all edible, can be used for that. Borage is commonly grown on contract in Saskatchewan. And something to note about these specialty crops, you really need to know your markets before you start getting into them, because a single grower can really change the volume that's in the market at the time, and so and those markets can be very volatile, so you really need to know what you're doing before you get into it. I had walked past valerian, which we are starting to grow with another pharmaceutical type crop. You're going to end up using the roots from these. And if we keep moving down this way, we're going to start seeing a crop that looks probably pretty familiar to some people, of hemp. And so this is hemp that's actually grown for the oil and the seed. We're looking for CBD oil production. But in Saskatchewan, we can grow hemp also for industrial uses. And more varieties are being released as this is getting more exposure and research done with it. If we turn over here, we have some hops varieties which are becoming more popular in Saskatchewan now that the microbrewing industry is growing. There is potential for expanding into hops. And then our next crop that we have coming up is cilantro or coriander. So if you're growing cilantro, you're going to be harvesting it for the leaves, and this will be going into an edible market, where coriander has been grown in Saskatchewan for a while, and that's when you're harvesting these plants for the seeds and the oil. This has been a particularly difficult year for starting some of these trials. COVID did not help setting this up and getting access to land, and so a lot of these plants are actually seeded late and they're looking a little stunted and maybe not as far along as we would have hoped. This plot here is actually not germinated yet, and we've reseeded and we're hoping to get a better start on it, and this was our caraway plot, which is another crop that's fairly common for a herb and spice crop in Saskatchewan, grown for its oil seed. And next we have chicory, which is looking kind of like carrots and is just starting to come up. This was a later start for us. Now chicory is a large taproot that kind of almost looks like parsnips when you're growing it, and it is grown for inulin production, which is a product that you'll find is like soluble fibers and used as ingredients. Moving up, our last plant that I have to talk about is oregano. It's a Greek oregano, and so also used in the edible markets as a herb, a seasoning, or can be grown for its oil, and you can extract oregano oil. So in conclusion, I guess I'd like to just say that if you are interested in trying a smaller area to a specialty crop or a herb, definitely try to get a hold of the Saskatchewan Herb, Spice and Specialty Crop Association. They have great experience and would love to share their knowledge on it. You can also get a hold of ICDC and see the trials that we've been trying here, maybe make an appointment, come out and get to know some of these plants. Definitely do your homework on these types of crops, know how the markets are acting at the time, what market needs are out there. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you for letting me take a moment and show you our trial.
That was Kara's presentation. I guess I'll invite her now to come on and answer any questions or comments the audience has.
Hi, Joel.
Again, if you'd like to use the chat function, go ahead and do that, and I can read out the question.
Kara, I'm wondering what kind of chicory you used and where you got it from.
We had a Madgeburg variety chicory, and I believe it was ordered through Stokes. We had actually better success with it last year and had pretty good production from it. This year, like I said, it was just sort of a slow start and slow germination.
Sarah, I got a question. Out of all the crops you talked about today, which one do you think has the most potential to be more widely adopted in Saskatchewan?
Personally, I think that the hemp's getting pretty common. Producers are more comfortable with growing it, and the markets are already there, so I think that's a good option.
For sure, and we have seen some irrigated hemp production in the past few years, so I think it's definitely something that's of more interest to local irrigators here. Any other questions? If not, I'm sure we're going to be talking about these crops more in the future, so stay tuned to hear more information and the results of this demo. So thanks, Kara, for signing on, and we'll move on to our next talk.
Thank you.
So for the last two speakers here, it's going to be more of a focus on fruit and vegetable crops. So as most of you know, ICDC has been implementing a horticulture program, I think, since 2015. And this year we had to reduce our horticulture program by quite a bit just due to the pandemic. But we do have a few projects located both on station and at producer fields. So we're going to go ahead now and play Dr. Doug Waters' video on some of the work he's doing at a local irrigator's field with vegetables.
Hi, my name is Doug Waterer. I'm formerly the vegetable crop specialist at the University of Saskatchewan. Retired a number of years ago, but just couldn't let the vegetable industry go. So I am doing some work in affiliation with Connie and Timichuk and Kara Drury. In this particular project, which is sponsored by the Adopt Fund, is a project to try to help Saskatchewan's pumpkin growers deal with some disease issues. Pumpkins are an excellent crop in Saskatchewan. There's a lot of demand. We generally can grow a decent pumpkin crop. If we have another tough fall, I'm not so sure about that. But one of the things that pumpkin growers face every fall is having fruit that don't quite mature properly. And if they've not had an opportunity to fully mature, they're very prone to disease. Now, we can't do an awful lot about making our growing seasons longer or warmer. So what we are attempting to do is to try to deal with that disease while the plants are still in the field. So that's what this project is about. What we have here is 4 varieties of pumpkins ranging in maturity from a very early maturing type, which we don't expect to get a lot of disease, but unfortunately they don't produce big fruit, to a very late variety, which, although it will produce spectacular fruit, going to have all kinds of problem with disease. So we're growing this in this trial, and what we're going to do is to treat the plants as the growing season progresses in an attempt to control this disease. The products that we're using are registered fungicides, and we've got 2 basic approaches here. One of them is a standard regimen of fungicides. The other is a little bit different approach, which is to try to use some biocontrol agents, some biologicals. It's the greener option, and these days we are definitely being encouraged to try to look at the potential to use some lower risk, less environmentally impactful products. Okay, so this project, we will be beginning to spray the plants as they come into bloom, because that's when the disease gets into the flowers and then is subsequently spread into the fruit. And then we will continue on about 2-week intervals right through until harvest time. When the fruit are harvested, they will be brought into cold storage and then observed over about a 1-month storage period of time. That's when the disease typically strikes. And what it does is it causes the fruit to rot, causes the stem to fall off, causes the pumpkins to just generally become unmarketable. And so what we're going to be doing is to compare the efficacy of the various treatments and also to look at the economics of those treatments. Is it worthwhile to apply these products? At present, very few growers actually treat their pumpkins with any type of fungicides at all. They just hope they have a good growing season. Okay, ideally we will be conducting this project in a second year just to confirm the results of this particular growing season, and perhaps modify the treatments a little bit, and hopefully come up with some results and some information that will be useful to the growers. The trial that I'm standing in front of right now is a trial that we're doing in association with the Strategic Field Program. This one is looking at the potential to grow processing pickling cucumbers here in Saskatchewan. So this is the cucumbers that would be turned into the pickles you're familiar with, either the gherkins or the full-size picklers. Saskatchewan, again, has a long history of growing pickling cucumbers, but always for the farmer's market, never on a commercial scale. There is, though, an opportunity to scale up the whole process if we can figure out a way to grow the varieties of cucumbers that are going to do well here in Saskatchewan that also have suitability for processing. So not only do they have to be early and yield well and look good, but they also have to produce a really good, crisp, nice green, fresh-looking pickle. So that's what this trial is all about. We're looking at 6 varieties of cucumber in this particular trial. We are planting them in a manner that is representative of how growers would do it if they were going to mechanically harvest. So you can see behind me that the rows of the cucumbers are actually very close together, unusually so. And if you're just aware of the fact that if you're going to mechanically harvest, they're only going to be gone over once. So you have to put a lot of plants into the field and try to maximize your yields in any one particular point in time. So this trial here will be harvested at 6 intervals, starting in the first week of August and going into the second week of September, or frost, whichever comes first. And what we'll do is we will simulate mechanical harvest by pulling the plants out, stripping off all the fruit, and then going through and figure out which of those fruit are suitable size for pickling, which ones will be good for gherkins, those are the premium pickles, which one's a regular size, which one are a little bit oversized, those just become relish, which ones are garbage. We would do that sequentially over the 6 harvests, and that information will be used to tell growers this is the anticipated yield, and also this is when you can anticipate that the harvest is going to begin. This is going to be the optimum time to harvest. Harvest might continue through until such and such a period of time. Give the growers a sense as to how they can arrange their farm, how they can arrange their plantings, how they can allocate their machinery and their crews in order to make maximum yields, maximum productivity, maximum profitability. This is the second year of the project. Last year's project was surprisingly successful, particularly given the fact it wasn't actually that good of a growing season. The yields actually were quite surprising. We're always a little bit reluctant to over-interpret yields from small plot trials, but the yields were actually higher than the yields they get in Ontario. So that was a promising step for us. The cucumbers were then sent off to the food center in Saskatoon to be turned into pickles, and that process of evaluating those pickles is still ongoing. This year we changed out a couple of varieties, basically discarded varieties that didn't do well, added some additional varieties. And we also added a slightly different component to the project, which is in addition to using standard pickling seeded varieties, we're actually doing a completely separate trial of seedless cucumbers. There's a lot of debate as to whether the industry is actually changing with consumer preference, that people want a pickle that doesn't actually contain any seeds inside. They're completely different varieties, so we're also looking at that aspect. When I talk about varieties, you can see that there's considerable difference in the performance of the varieties. Variety number 3 here, you can see that the stand is really quite poor. This variety clearly not well adapted, not something that we're likely to recommend it to growers. By contrast, the variety over here, you can see that it's a much more solid stand. In a matter of a week's time or so, this is the second week of July, in another week or so this will have fully covered the ground. It will be flowering the next week, and we're probably on schedule to harvest in the first week of August, even though again this growing season has not been spectacularly warm. Ultimately, we want to use this information as a stepping off point. If it looks like the numbers are going to work and the growers are enthusiastic about the concept of taking Saskatchewan's cucumber industry the next step, and start to talk with a processor. This project is done in affiliation with Dan Erlandson. Dan is one of the largest growers of broccoli in the province of Saskatchewan. There's an excellent demand for Saskatchewan grown broccoli. We can do a great job, except for the fact that from time to time we have some significant problems getting the crop established. What Dan has been finding is that when he puts his transplants out early in the spring, and he likes to get an early start on things, there are situations, years, where a good portion of his crop, rather than producing a really nice standard head like I have here of broccoli, it instead produces something that looks like this. So a completely unmarketable product. And so the question Dan came to me was, what is going on? We did some research, looked at the literature, came up with a couple of ideas. The first idea that we came up with is that the thought is that his plants were being exposed to excessively cold temperatures, either in the greenhouse, that would be very unusual, as Dan is getting the plants ready to transplant into the field, he's hardening them off for a few days. Is it possible they were being exposed to cold air, or were the plants being exposed to cold after he transplanted them in the field? Obviously, at that point, he has very little control over what conditions they're exposed to, other than he could potentially wait another 2 weeks, transplant out when conditions are hopefully going to be a little bit more favorable. So what this project did is it actually exposed transplants to a number of temperature treatments. So we had a very, very low temperature treatment. The plants were actually exposed to 0 degrees, or a little bit cool treatment. They're exposed to 7 degrees Celsius, which is fairly cool, but broccoli's pretty tough. Or they weren't stressed at all. They were exposed to 20 degrees. And then what we did is we exposed them to those temperatures for either 1 day or 7 days to see whether there was a duration effect. We then brought the plants out into the field, transplanted them, and then we've now been observing them. And what you can see is that I think we're definitely on to something here. This treatment here, you can see that every one of the plants has actually started to produce these premature heads. These plants are going to produce something that really isn't a marketable product. And I happen to know that these plants are the ones that were exposed to low temperatures for an extended period of time before they were transplanted. So that's giving Dan and myself a pretty good hint that it's cold stress that is causing the problem, and he's going to have to be careful about that going forward. It's going to be very difficult to convince Dan not to transplant out early, but he is going to have to bear in mind that he is taking a risk. Over here you see the way the plants should look. These were put in the field at the same time. You can see they're nowhere near starting to produce a head, but when they do produce a head, it will look like that. It will be a marketable product. So again, some pretty good evidence that it is a low temperature stress that is causing the problem, at least on broccoli. We also have a corresponding trial where we're looking at similar problems that Dan's been experiencing in some of his other cole crops. This is Brussels sprouts. This is the way a normal Brussels sprout plant should look. There's a single stalk. What you can see here, though, is a Brussels sprout plant that rather than producing a single stalk, it's producing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different stalks. These stalks are going to be branched all over the place, and basically they're going to be useless to Dan. Again, a situation where something in the field has caused this abnormal growth. That's this phenomenon in Brussels sprouts. Sees the same thing in cabbage. There's a good standard looking head of cabbage, great looking cabbage in the second week of July. But this is what, unfortunately, he's seeing all too often in his field. Rather than producing a single head, it's producing 1, 2, 3 very small and unmarketable heads. Again, this phenomenon appears to be occurring. It's a stress that is occurring very early in the development of the crop. We think within days of being transplanted. The initial theory was that it was the cold stress, very similar to what you see in the broccoli project. But in this particular year, we've exposed cabbage to those same temperature treatments as I outlined in the broccoli and saw absolutely no effect. So we don't think it's actually cold stress that's responsible for this abnormality. It's something else. Got all kinds of theories. One of them is all the wind that we had this spring, particularly if that wind is starting to move some soil, we get some sand blasting, but that's another theory in another project. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to determine what's causing the abnormalities and to be able to come up with some recommendations that are going to help growers avoid what is obviously quite a damaging phenomenon. This is a 2-year project. We will be looking at the results from this year's project, proceeding next year, changing some of the treatments, and hopefully come up with some answers for the growers.
That was Doug's talk. I don't think Doug was actually able to make it today, but we do have Connie Timonchuk, our provincial vegetable crop specialist, online here, it seems. So she'd be able to take any questions the audience has. I guess first of all, did you want to comment anything yourself, Connie, or?
No, it's as you can tell from that last trial, there's a lot going on, and a lot of things to learn in this getting this industry kickstarted. But that's the game. That's what makes it challenging and fun.
For sure. We do have one question here in the chat, so it's from Anthony Eliason. He wants to know, how long can a pickling cucumber last in storage before needing to be pickled? And will a short time period slow uptake of the crop due to processing time?
Yeah, the crop will only have about, it can't last much more than a week in storage before it needs to be pickled. So definitely it's probably a matter of having larger acres and staggering that harvest.
Don't see any other questions right now. Anybody from the audience like to ask a question about these projects, or I guess vegetable production in general too? Connie is the expert, so.
If not, you know where to find me.
Yeah, for sure. If anybody's interested in looking at these very high value crops, feel free to contact Connie and she can provide you some information to help get started. Great. Well, thanks for coming on, Connie, and we'll proceed on to our final talk.
Thanks a lot. Have a great day.
So our last talk of the day is by our provincial fruit specialist for Scarf. He's going to be talking about some adopt projects that are actually happening at CSADC in the orchard area. His talks, the videos that we recorded were a lot more detailed. I did have to condense it a little bit just to fit in the format for today. So if you're interested in learning more about these projects, we will plan to release the full videos at some point. But I'll go ahead and get this video going right now.
I am Forrest Scarf. I'm the provincial specialist for fruit crops. I work for the Ministry of Agriculture and I'm based out of Regina, Saskatchewan. But I also help out at the CSIDC site in Outlook, Saskatchewan, and that's what we're going to look at today. I'm at CSIDC today. That's the Canada-Saskatchewan Irrigation Diversification Center. And I'm talking about some of our adopt projects that have gone through over the past couple of years and trying to show some of the results that we can see here today. We're in the raspberry patch right now, and we've got 4 different varieties that are randomized in this plot. And there was a treatment that was done last summer. And what happened here is we had 2 rows that weren't treated, and these 2 rows that were treated. The treatment was that they were mowed to the ground and allowed to grow back. And so these 2 rows include what are called primocanes and floricanes. And so maybe if we can come in a little bit closer, I'll try to show a primocane versus a floricane. So if you see these canes that have fruit on them and the bees are buzzing around and they're going to set fruit, those are floricanes. They're the 2nd year growth, and usually what happens is a plant will send up these, the primocanes. If you can see this green cane that doesn't have any fruit buds on it at all, that's a primocane. So this year, for this particular type of cultivar or of raspberry, it'll just grow up and it won't set fruit. But next year, that cane will be the floricane and it'll produce all this fruit that you're seeing developing here. This was a pretty harsh winter this year, so there was some kill, and you can see the top kill on some of these. There was some worry about how extensive that was going to be and how much it was going to damage. Typically, if it's just top kill, the plant will fill in below where the kill was and produce fruit. It didn't do that much damage, so these look okay. So what happened last year is those floricanes in these 2 rows, of course, produced fruit. These 2 rows that were mowed to the ground only had primicanes that were coming up. And so what happened there is the majority of the cultivars did not produce fruit. There was one exception, and that was the Prelude cultivar. And that one fruits on primicanes as well as floricanes. This cultivar here is Prelude, and it sets up on its primicanes and it produces later in the fall. So we didn't get the early flush like you see now, but the later flush coming from the primicanes actually did produce fruit. So in terms of if you were going to adopt this practice, if you were doing it with crops like Red Bounty, Red Mammoth, or Nova, the standard cultivars, those ones, if you mow it to the ground, you're not going to get fruit production in that year. But with Prelude, the advantage in this cultivar is that you can mow it to the ground, you'll still get fruit production. It'll be later in the season, but you get something. You can mow these raspberries to the ground. It's a huge labor saving opportunity, and the other side of it is that you can reduce disease, because as the canopy gets older, disease develops and it's hard to get rid of that. So this is a method to kind of clean that up and reduce your disease incidence. This is the Saskatoon portion of the cut and burn project, and so this was mowed to the ground, and literally all these, you can see some of the trees over here that are the mature size. We took a similar stretch of orchard row and cut it down to the ground. Now, one portion of the row was not treated, and so that was just cut and let to regrow. One portion was cut to the ground and then burnt. Then the third treatment was cutting it to the ground, and then when the new plants started to grow, applying a product called Apogee, that's prohexadione calcium, and it's meant to help reduce the amount of fire blight that some plants are susceptible to. Fire blight is a bacterial disease, and so this product helps reduce the ability of fire blight to spread from plant to plant. And some of those aspects of the trial are evident in what we see here. And so I'll maybe just start talking about this first plot. This plot was cut to the ground and burnt. Now, if you come in closer, you'll see symptoms of fire blight. So these little shepherd's crook type necrotic tissue that are at the ends of some of these branches are symptomatic of fire blight. We think about here is where we start, where the burn treatment was. So these plants here, I don't see any fire blight in this plot. They were burnt to the ground, well, they're cut to the ground and burnt, and the burning process reduces a lot of the disease. It also seems to reduce weed presence to a certain extent. So that's the burn treatment. The Apogee treatment that's further down wasn't as successful, and in this treatment there wasn't a burn, and you can see it's a little bit messier in here. And I don't know if it's a true function of the treatment or not, but there doesn't seem to be as much production. So it's a bit messier and less productive. So the general recommendation from what we're seeing here is to go with the cut to the ground and burn the plots. This Adopt project had to do with apples and pears, and one of the issues with apples especially has been that they're susceptible to fire blight, and now we've got a kind of new disease composite at rapid apple decline. There's no single disease that's responsible or
organism that's responsible. It's kind of a composite of different things that come together that cause the plants to die rapidly. Aside from that, the traditional rootstock, because in order to get high volumes of production, you plant a lot of different trees in a space. So instead of the traditional method of planting one apple tree every 15-20 feet, now they're planting apple trees every 2 or 3 feet, depending upon the cultivar and that sort of thing. When you're grafting the sign wood, that's the desirable apple fruit that you want, onto the rootstock. So we wanted to look at different varieties of rootstock to see what was the best suited for our environment. One of the challenges has been, obviously, number one is winter hardiness, and then number two, a lot of our rootstock has been susceptible to fire blight. So this first portion of the plot is pear. So these first, I think it's 7 plants, are OH by F 333. These came from Oregon, and they're moderately winter hardy, but they appear to be a little bit susceptible to fire blight. There is some regrowth that's happening. So this top, there was growth right up to the top here. So this is about 2.5 feet tall, but it appears to have died over winter almost to the ground. So we've got new growth coming up from the ground. So these aren't quite hardy enough for what you'd want in Saskatchewan. And that's I guess probably all we need to know. It also appears to be susceptible to fire blight. So you can see this one it has a burnt look, and you know, like the name says, it's a fire blight. So it appears to have been burnt out. So even though it might have been able to survive winter, it wasn't able to overcome the fire blight that it got infected with this spring. This is a different one. Again, it's OHX by F 97. So that's a cross of 2 different types of pear that are supposed to have fire blight resistance and also have good quality fruit. But you know, again, it looks like it's susceptible to fire blight. You can see there's no leaves down until this point. Now, if you were trying to save this plant, you would cut off well below where the infection has progressed to, and try to treat it with products like kasugamycin and maybe some apogee. These ones, I believe, are Usurian pears, and these are the shortest of the pear type, and they are apparently a fire blight resistance. You've got fire blight right here, right next to this plant, but this one isn't infected as much, although I guess if I look more carefully, they do have some fire blight on them. It's just not spreading as much. So they have a bit of resistance, and they certainly appear to be more winter hardy. The next one is Geneva 890, and you can see there's pretty good growth on here. This one is less dwarfing than the others, but pretty lush growth and consistent overwintering, and I don't see much fire blight. There's a little bit on this plant, but it appears to have some resistance. So this might be a pretty good option for some Saskatchewan producers. This one is Geneva 210, and the Geneva series, I should mention, I believe most of that breeding work was done at Cornell University. So Geneva, New York is where Cornell is near. It's in Ithaca, New York, so I guess this material is named after that region of New York State. So this one didn't do too well. I wouldn't recommend that. Then we move on to Geneva 935. And again, this one's fairly consistently hardy, and I don't see very much fire blight, so that might be a good option. So we also had a project for 2020 here that wasn't able to proceed, and due to COVID-19, we're not allowed to have as many people researching, and certain projects aren't allowed to continue unless they were sort of a continuation of former projects. This year I was going to do a project that related to blindwood. So
Particularly in 2019 and again in 2020, we've had this phenomenon. It's kind of an overwintered damage. It can also be related to certain cultivar susceptibilities, but what happens is that large parts of the branch just do not develop, and in this case it might be winter damage. You can see, if you can get a close-up on this, that there's large areas of the plant where the leaves didn't develop, and it's just a tuft of leaves at the end of the branch. This is also associated with greatly reduced production of fruit. So you can see on this somewhat long branch, there's only 3 fruit that actually made it through and are producing, or will likely go until they're ready to be harvested. Each of these should have had about 5 flowers, and often you lose 1 flower, but you would still have 4 fruit per cluster. So this is probably less than 25% of the production that you should expect, and it also weakens the tree over time because you have less leaves to do photosynthesis that helps support the vigor of the plant. So what we had proposed to do was in Michigan, they use an application of ProGib. ProGib is a gibberellin, and gibberellins help plants. It's a plant hormone that helps them grow, and it apparently stimulates some of the buds that are further down and helps to overcome blindwood. And it also evens out the production level, so you don't have sort of biennial bearing where in one year you have a very heavy production and the next year you have very low production. Apparently when you apply ProGib, it evens out that productivity over the years, but overall, if you measured it over 10 years, you would have a higher yield over that 10-year period than you would had you not applied those. So we were going to try that in 2020, but unfortunately that one won't proceed. We'll have to do that next year.
That was Forest Talk. As I mentioned, it was cut down quite a bit, so if you'd like to see the full videos, they'll be released at a later time. I'll invite Forrest now to turn on his webcam and mic, and he can answer any questions the audience might have. Or if he wants to elaborate on anything that might have been taken out of the video, he's welcome to do that too.
I should mention that when I was talking about the Saskatoons, I made an error when I was talking about the first treatment. I said it was burnt. That one was the control. It wasn't burnt. That's where you found the fire blight. So if you were paying attention to that, please note that I made an error there.
Okay, any questions from the audience? Do you see an increase of acres of apples and pears due to some of these newer varieties coming out, or how's the current industry in the province?
I wouldn't say that it's expanding rapidly at this point with the apples. There have been issues, and again, talking about rapid apple decline, that's hit a few of the larger producers pretty extensively. And then unfortunately this spring we had flooding in one of the larger orchards as well. So that's kind of negatively impacted things. But on the other hand, we've got some companies like, you know, the cider producers that are expanding. So Crossmount Cidery, just south of Saskatoon, they're continuing to produce apples and are creating these products, and there's pretty good success with you know, the expansion of that component of the industry. So you know, it's growing slowly, but it's had its trials and tribulations too. So yeah, and that's part of the reason why we're doing some of these studies, is to prevent some of that from happening in the future, so that people can have more confidence in the investments that they're making in creating an apple orchard, for example.
You think there's quite a bit of room to grow in terms of Saskatchewan production of apples and pears? Is there market demand if we start growing a high quality crop in larger quantities?
Yeah, I think so. And we do have good quality apples. The pears not as good quality, although the University of Saskatchewan is developing some new varieties that are really good tasting. I always like to use the little story from when I was working at the university. There was a gentleman, Tim Stacy, who worked at the research lab, and he didn't like pears, but we had one particular pear that's a mixture of a Chinese variety with some of the more standard ones, and it really was exceptionally flavorful. And he said, despite the fact that he didn't like pears, he liked this pear more than any apples, and he was an apple fan. But we do have good apples as well, and again, most of those were bred at the University of Saskatchewan. So there's a combination of different things and different types of apples. There's the sort of fresh eating ones that we have good quality varieties, and then there's also cider apples, which are more specifically bred to have some bitterness components to them because it provides better flavor for the ciders when they make those products. So, we have a combination of different varieties that are well suited to the market, and there is demand for those, and demand for local as well is increasing, I think.
Great. I see Gary Nadowich, he has his hand up, so you can go ahead and ask your question, Gary.
For us, I'm an old dirt-kicking agronomist, and I like to plant a crop and harvest it in the same year, and I'll grudgingly allow maybe some forages to come into the my sphere of influence that I can harvest over a couple of years. So I apologize because I'm a Luddite when it comes to the fruit industry, but for something like the pears, I'm watching that nursery. You planted them last year, and I'm watching in fascination. So what is the time for something like pears and apples from the time of planting to your first harvest?
Yeah.
And then subsequent to that, what is the lifespan of, say, an apple orchard, do you think, in Saskatchewan for productivity?
Right. Well, there's sort of some complicated answer, I guess. I'll try to make it a little bit simple, but with pears, most of the time they're going to be planted as seedlings, and it would take potentially 10 years before they would start to produce at mature levels. So that's quite a lengthy time to have to wait for a plant to produce fruit. And that's part of the reason, and it's a similar thing for seedlings of apples, but when you graft them onto a rootstock, and particularly a dwarfing rootstock, it reduces that juvenility phase of the plant, and so you could start to get production within 4 years of when you planted it. It's still a lengthy period of time before you're getting, so these are long-term investments, and there is risk associated with that. So it takes a particular type of person and investor to be able to weather that. So yeah, 4 years before you're starting to get decent production, but then the returns are good once you've got that production. And in terms of the length of the lifespan after that, you should expect at least, in the range of 30 years of mature growth, although there are always disease issues. You have to manage that and, control the growth with pruning and other things in terms of, apples and those sorts of plants. There are other fruit options that are much quicker, and we have a strategic field program for HASCAP that's up at the Conservation Learning Center. Those plants were planted last year, and a significant number of them have some pretty good production on them already. So that's a quicker return investment. And raspberries are somewhat similar. You can get production in that first year. And for example, with the Prelude variety, it produced in the first year that we planted it. So, you know, those options might work if you wanted to plant apples, and then between the rows you could include some of the quicker fruit producing varieties of plants or species of plants. So there's different models for overcoming that lag when you get a return on investment.
Thank you.
Great. Any final questions for Forrest before we close the meeting for today? If not, thank you, Forrest, for signing on. All good information there, and definitely some exciting work you're working on out there.
So, thanks.
Well, that concludes the virtual field day today. It was definitely a new thing for us to do here, so I apologize for the laggy videos. In the future, if we need to do an event like this, I'll try to find an alternative internet source, which would help with that problem, I think. But this video was recorded, and hopefully that recording will be a less laggy video. So we'll make sure to put that on YouTube and advertise that on social media as well. As mentioned, there is CCA credits available for this meeting. So in the email I sent out, just reply to me with your CCA number and your name, and I'll make sure to get you signed up on the credit application form. So thank you for everybody for coming out today. And I think besides the video feed, the audio seemed to be working good, and there's some good conversations. So too bad we couldn't do it out in the field, but when there's crazy things that happen, like what's happening this year, it was the only alternative we could really think of. So thanks for coming out and trying this experience.
Thanks, Joel.
Thanks for your effort, Joe.